Rakugo is a traditional storytelling art dating from the 17th century. A single performer acts out comical and human interest stories, using only a folding fan and a small hand towel as props.
すみません、この傘借りますよ。どうしたの？これ下のお店のやつ。そう。どれどれ。なるほど。なるほど。これ下の店の名前確かに書いてある。なるほどね。
The performer uses his fan as if it's an opening umbrella, and the audience's imaginations complete the picture. Here he uses the hand towel to represent a book.
あった。ここなんかいいですよ。
This technique of allusion, using one thing to suggest another, is called mitate. Mitate is an expressive technique rooted in Japanese art and culture. With realistic props, audiences don't need to use their imaginations. Rakugo strips everything down to its simplest form. With skillful use of just two very basic props, we can effectively stimulate the power of imagination and more deeply involve the audience. You can also see mitate in traditional Japanese gardens. A kare-sansui, or dry landscape garden, suggests the natural scenery of mountains and rivers, but without any water. This garden is modelled after the actual river that flows nearby. Patterns in the gravel suggest the ripples of flowing water. Your imagination transforms the raked gravel into a river. Such techniques are common in traditional Japanese garden design. Naturally, mitate is found in Japanese cuisine too. An essential element of washoku is a technique called kazari-giri. This is a way of carving food to resemble various other objects. Anyone can learn kazari-giri to enjoy at home. Kumagai Mayumi teaches kazari-giri to both Japanese and overseas visitors. These flowers are actually daikon radish. They're made by rolling thin slices of daikon radish into floral shapes. Carrots and lotus root are also easy to carve. Such decorations make any meal more attractive and enjoyable. Not many people can master the more difficult techniques. I realize that to ensure this art will continue, I would have to teach a simpler version so that anyone can enjoy kazari-giri at home. That will make sure it gets passed on to the next generation. Mitate, an essential element of Japanese culture using the power of illusion and imagination to bring grace and humor into our lives. Japan's traditional costume, the kimono. In the past, this was an everyday garment. Today, it's mostly worn for special events and ceremonial occasions. The roots of the kimono date back to the 8th century. It went through many changes before evolving into the kimono we see today. Made in an almost limitless range of patterns and colors. Kimonos express the range of Japanese aesthetic sensibility. The Tango region faces the Sea of Japan in the north part of Kyoto Prefecture.
Great. Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you. Wasn't expecting a response, but welcome to the Japan Information and Culture Center, Embassy of Japan, for this evening's lecture, Unmasking Japanese Folklore, with author Natalie Anna Jacobsen. Thank you for laughing at that, too. My name is Marina, and I am the JICC's Cultural Affairs Coordinator. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to our guest, Jacobsen-san, as well as to the JICC team for making this evening possible. A quick reminder, please take a moment to silence your cell phones, and we kindly ask that you hold any questions until the end of the program. Following a brief moderated discussion, we will conclude with a Q&A session. Thank you all for attending this evening's event. I'd now like to introduce the Embassy of Japan's first secretary, Tomoko Nakamura.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Tomoko Nakamura. I'm first secretary at the Embassy of Japan's Public Affairs section. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Japan Information Culture Center for tonight's talk, Unmasking Japanese Folklore, Fact, Fiction, and Forgotten History with Natalie Anna Jacobsen. I'd also like to thank our colleagues from the Library of Congress, Cameron Penwell and Jesse Dryan, for their display booth featuring yokai and Meiji-Era prints from the library's collection. From mischievous kitsune and shape-shifting tanuki to kasa-obake and kappa, Japanese folklore has inspired countless stories and cultural references. Behind these fantastical beings are rich histories shaped by belief, fear, humor, and centuries of change. Tonight, our speaker will explore the origins of these tales, their evolution, especially during the Meiji era, and their ongoing role in Japanese life today. We are delighted to welcome Natalie Jacobsen, local author of Ghost Train, a historical novel set in 1877 Kyoto. Drawing on years in Japan and in-depth research, Natalie offers unique insight into how folklore evolved during a time of dramatic cultural and technological transformation. Her work reveals how real events gave rise to enduring myths that continue to shape Japanese identity and imagination. Natalie is an award-winning journalist and writer with a background in storytelling, community engagement, and leadership development. She studied creative writing at the University of St. Andrews, political science at Georgetown, and filmmaking at the New York Film Academy in Kyoto. Following tonight's talk, please stay for a casual networking reception, enjoy the Library of Congress exhibit, and Noryo, a Japanese tradition of enjoying the summer evening with good company and taste of sake. Thank you for joining us, and now please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Natalie Jacobsen.
Hi, good evening, and welcome to JICC. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Nakamura-san and Marina, so much for the introductions and for the invitation. It is an absolute honor to be here. I never had this on my bucket list, but I am very happy to check this box off it.
But thank you all for joining on this great muggy night in DC, where we will be talking about folklore all tonight and the histories that inspired the beloved stories that continue to unravel and that we want to unmask today. So, I guess let's get started, but the first thing I kind of want to prompt all of you with is thinking about how do we frame up folklore and what is folklore? Why do we still tell stories of the past today, and what are they trying to teach us? So all of these icons of Japan don't really need an introduction. In fact, I would kind of assume that most people who don't even know much about Japan would recognize these figures. And yes, this is as scary as it gets, I promise. You don't have to have much knowledge of Japanese history or folklore to know that these are prominent figures out of Japan. But what they all have in common is that they are derived from real events, real history, and folk tales of real people still passed down today. So in order to understand these stories, you need to understand the stories of the past. The utility of Japanese folklore is far and wide. These four, I had a tough time choosing which four to show the spectrum of Japanese folklore. And because it's tough because the lineup of folklore figures includes 8 million. There are an estimated 8 million different creatures, spirits, figures, beings, gods, and demons in Japanese folklore. They include the Japan's version of the pantheon of their gods who created the land, and the demons who seek to revenge in war, and then right down to the sillier creatures that are even created out of puns and language. Folklore is, in fact, Japanese history. So what connects all of them, yes, that weird umbrella on the left all the way to the skeleton on the right, is that they all have something to impart on audiences and generations to come. They each carry with them a lesson, a warning, or an inspiration that helps guide us all through life. They teach rights and wrongs, they inform and connect, and they explain the unexplainable. So I want to get through a few basics first, just to catch everyone up on the topics that we'll be covering in today's folklore lesson. So first though, I want you to think through, folklore is not such a foreign concept. Think about your own rituals, habits, beliefs, family stories, weird quirks, or even superstitions, and ask yourself, where did they come from? Why have they been passed down from generation to generation? Maybe you remember a threat your parents told you if you didn't go to bed on time, or if you wandered into the woods alone. Or maybe you step over cracks or avoid walking under ladders. All of those come from folk tales. So in Japanese folklore, all of these and more are explained and still explained today by yokai and different creatures that we will talk about today. The main characters in folklore are yurei, oni, and yokai. So first of all are yurei, which are the more haunting figures in folklore. Yurei are considered Japanese folklore versions of spirits or ghosts that return to haunt, primarily seeking revenge. They can be poltergeists that can move and interact with objects and embody other nefarious purposes and motivations. They are generally unbound by a physical form and are able to change shape and pass through walls. So if we go back in time and look at the tale of Genji, which is the world's oldest book, and it came from Japan, there is, of course, the revengeful ghost in it, Lady Rokujo, who grew so jealous of rage upon the death of Genji that she possessed his wife, ultimately killing her, and I'm very sorry for the spoiler alert. Her spirit continued to haunt others until Genji's daughter actually laid her bones properly to rest and performed the correct spiritual rites, which brings peace to an upset yurei. Now, in Japanese folklore, anyone and everyone has potential to be a yurei. However, most don't cause problems, especially if they've received the proper burial and spiritual respect. But, of course, there are some reasons that some families may be left in anguish and concerned about their ancestors, especially during conflict, disasters, tsunami, and pandemics, when there are mass burials or reason for hasty buryings, which means that they sometimes have to skip steps. So oftentimes after a war or after a famine, there are an increase in stories of yurei coming back. Yurei, therefore, have also unlimited inspiration for stories built upon fears of an enemy returning upon their death, or those hoping to see a loved one again or seek wisdom from a leader who has passed. Their stories likely resonate the most with those around the world, as almost every culture has some kind of belief in ghosts or spirits or the afterlife. The next type is oni, which loosely translates to beasts. They are kind of larger-than-life figures that appear Herculean or are likened a little bit to Greek mythology. They're often giant. They inflict a lot of terror and destruction. They're pretty gnarly. If you just look at that picture there, it kind of depicts one. And they have a proclivity towards murder and can usually be differentiated from other yokai by the number of claws or teeth that they have, similar to a labubu. They are typically male and prominent in ukiyo-e more than other types of creatures, especially we'll talk about later with samurai. Today, though, oni are typically seen as guardians. You'll see them outside temples and shrines and are considered strongest who can defeat any demon or beast. So they must have had a great PR campaign, because I don't know how that happens. But yokai are my favorite to delve into. Yokai can truly represent or embody nearly anything. So while a yurei is unbound by physical form, a yokai is bound by physical form. They can have some characteristics of ghosts and some of oni as well, which makes them a whole spectrum of very interesting creatures and beings to work with. They also can stand in for all kinds of useful metaphors and explanations for when science at the time historically had none to offer. Now, right here we have the translation demons. I will say I don't really like that direct translation because that kind of has a negative connotation in English. Supernatural being is kind of more likely, it's just so many more syllables. But they can be sprite-like, they can be helpful, they can be good, they can be mischievous, and sometimes downright devilish. In fact, their name yokai actually means suspicious. They usually will have a power or two of some kind that's unique to them. They can possibly even shapeshift, like the kitsune, bakemono, or obake. Unsurprisingly, there are much higher accounts of seeing yokai in historical time periods, as reasons for strange phenomena would usually be blamed on a rogue yokai. Then, of course, as time went on and as we entered especially the Meiji era, which we'll get into, science and rational explanations replaced yokai. So today they're used more for entertainment and caricatures of folklore and of culture of the past. Now, a lot of the yokai and the folklore that we're going to talk about is actually inspired by real events, some of which have been twisted so much as kind of unrecognizable, and some that still persist today. So there's a lot of history and context that we have to kind of dive into to really better understand where they may be derived from. And some of them I reckon a few of you might recognize, but you'll have to see how evolution changed their stories. It's kind of like a pretty epic game of telephone over the course of 1,000 years. So the first ones, and back to the spookiest ones, are yurei. So Yuki Onna is a very prominent ghost story. I'm sure a lot of you are feeling like you're familiar with at least one version of the story. Traditionally, a lot of ghost stories involve women being wronged, and this is not unusual for history, as power dynamics, family structure, forced marriages, mistresses, and war have often changed the way women are treated, usually leading to unfair circumstances or situations in which women will be attacked or threatened or abused. While most oni are depicted as males, and although anyone can be a yurei, most famous stories of yurei involve women. But the interesting thing is, most of the stories of yurei coming back are of women seeking revenge. They even have their own classification called onryo. They can be recognized by these visuals here with their long hair, because when they were alive, they were likely having their hair up, so in death, it's come undone, especially as they spiraled. They usually also wear plain robes, devoid of color, showing that it was drained from their life. So Yuki Onna is one of the most famous yurei out there. There are many variants, which is another fascinating look at Japanese culture and folklore across the prefectures, because Japan spans the main island from Hokkaido to Kagoshima, spans all the way from Maine basically to New Orleans. And Maine and New Orleans don't have as much folklore in common either. So it's the same thing. You would get many different stories and versions, even if you went city to city and asked the same person, asked people about the same yurei. So there are several different variants to her story, one of which is a woman who was forced into marriage, and she stepped into a bath and disintegrated instantly, turning only into a piece of ice, perhaps representing her resentment toward the marriage and symbolizing how cold she became for the rest of her life in his presence. Another depiction, though, is of people getting lost in the mountains and imagining that there was a mischievous woman who would hold up mirrors and play to their fears and keep confusing them in the snowy mountains until they succumb to their symptoms. Men have also been known to see her at night and have said they've tried to rescue her, surprised by how cold she was. But when she came into their house, she would kill them, unless they nurtured her with hot tea before she killed them. There is also a tale of a woman, though, who married a man in the mountains, but because his work, he would travel down from the mountains in spring, summer, and fall for harvests and agricultural purposes. And he had a second wife in the valley. So when the winter wife found out, she tried to plot to kill him when he returned to winter to be with her, to keep his spirit all to herself. But instead, he took her life first, condemning her to a life in the mountains where she could only watch below and wander winter forever. Now, all those different stories, though, likely came from somewhere. There are plenty of evidence and family stories of real life similarities that could compare to really any of these tales. Because like in the blizzard, people often get lost in the mountains and will see apparitions, and unable to be saved, they'll wander around lost. People maybe with illnesses will wander around screaming at night during a snowstorm and heard crying or confused. And sometimes frozen corpses have been found and mistaken for monsters. Most commonly, a lot of missing children have been found in the mountains, believed to be taken by women who were unable to bear children and who were banished to the mountains and blamed on a scandal. So these tales are pretty bleak. They are often filled with sorrow, but they serve purposes to tell children, one, don't go near the woods and the mountains, especially in snow and during bad weather, but also maybe to the husbands to treat their wives right. Now, oni normally don't have standalone tales. They are rarely the star of their own show. They are actually a figure meant to be taken down by the real hero of the story. So in fact, in history, you'll often hear exaggerated stories from samurai, priests, and emperors or princes who took on giant oni to prove themselves worthy for leadership and protect cities that they loved. Shutendoji is one of the most famous tales of a boy who grew up stronger and faster than any of his teachers at a rate that they could not keep up with. And he had a voracious diet, and it became so voracious that he eventually started eating animals and people and was banished to the mountains again. They ordered a whole troop of samurai to try to take him down. It was Raiko, a famous samurai, who did defeat him. But what's interesting about Shutendoji is that they believe that decapitation was the main way to kill a beast like this. But Shutendoji is special. He was able to still bite after he was decapitated. His head is supposedly in the temple in Nara. I'll leave it to your eyes to judge that. So each part of Japan, from the mountains of Hokkaido to Okinawa, all also have versions of this story. And so what you're probably thinking is, well, how on earth would Shutendoji have a real version of this? Well, it's believed, for example, that the cave that Shutendoji escaped into was a metaphor for the barrier between the real life and the afterlife, and that he straddled between both worlds as he was both human and beast. And he was bloodthirsty, but that might have also been inspired by another real event. In the year 1000, around the time Shutendoji came out for the first time, there was a German ship that crashed into what is Miyazu today. The Germans were observed drinking a very thick wine that had a blood-like texture. And because they were delirious from being starved and lost at sea, they appeared to be like monsters. They were also infected and riddled with smallpox, so that might have also played up the image. So there's inspiration all around throughout history that might have contributed to those images of Shutendoji. Now, Gashadokuro is a fan favorite. Sometimes, though, yokai are political. Gashadokuro is one of those. And this print, you may have seen it on shirts, albums, in museums, and countless books. And it's a giant skeleton. How could anyone know what to do in the face of one of those, and how could that possibly be real, much less political? It goes back to a warning earlier about proper burials, like in Genji. Rituals are deeply important in Shintoism and Buddhism alike, and following the right steps could be the difference between peace or revenge in Japanese folklore. This story was first told in the 10th century and revolves around the family drama of upper nobility. 3 men were fighting over the desire to marry one woman, as they do, and one uncle, Masakado, stepped in to intervene but made matters worse, burned down a lot of family houses, accidentally killed a lot of his own relatives, and then the family sought revenge on him, saying that he ruined a good deal. However, he fought back with 100 strong samurai and took down 1,000 others. So now finally the government got their eyes on it, and Kyoto said, well, let's put a bounty on his head. He was, after many attempts, finally beheaded, and his head was separated and carried to Kyoto while his body remained in Tokyo, meaning he didn't get a proper burial. So Masakado's daughter, Takayasha, thankfully was a renowned sorceress. So she conjured up all the bones of her father and all his soldiers who had also perished in the conflict and summoned them to march on Kyoto and seek revenge in his stead. So this was meant to represent the restless bones that were so angry that they could not be at peace until the body was restored. So yes, the head was returned to the body, and there is still, his gravesite is still somewhere that's visited quite often in Tokyo. So the legend of Gashadokuro, though, has prevailed ever since and throughout history, particularly during war and uprising. There's also been a number of famines throughout Japanese history, usually by droughts or disease from Europe. Fields and streets have sometimes been filled with bones, in which families imagined Gashadokuro would come alive at night and wander the streets, devouring what they missed in life. That's a bleak story. Okay, so let's go to something else a little bit more lighthearted. So, everyday phenomena and yokai. Yanari, they're pictured there on the left, the little goblin-like ones, might be the reason why your stairs creak. They hide in floorboards and shake your house, especially at night when you can't see them at all, very conveniently. Yanari had their existence proven, though, when a samurai visited an old lady's house once when she complained about hearing so much creaking she couldn't sleep at night. When the samurai plunged his sword between the floorboards, blood oozed out. The Yanari was dead, but as it turns out, it was likely someone hiding in the floorboards, as in winter it was cold, and he believed the woman to be blind and deaf and that he wouldn't be spotted. Now, Kappa, on the right-hand side, that little green figure, is a turtle, frog, human-like reptiloid known to inhabit waters and drown people if they disrespected him or nature. It's a very famous yokai that has been spotted all over different prefectures of Japan, and even there is a temple in Tokyo called Sogenji, or also colloquially known as Kappa-dera, which claims to have a mummified hand of one. I have not seen it. I will just share the news. Though today, Kappa is not necessarily recognized as a real-life creature, it is heralded as a mascot. And people recognize it as just this character throughout history that they just adore. It's also known to be disarmed by cucumbers. So there will often be cucumbers left at statues and shrines. They're known for their good deeds. So if you respect nature and give the kappa plenty of space and water, it will grant you maybe a wish. Now, how could that possibly be based on a real story? Well, 1,000 years ago, there were giant salamanders in Japan. And I mean giant. Like, we're talking a couple feet big, just about the right size for a kappa. So they used to roam Japan. There's also lots of monkeys in Japan, for those who were not familiar. And those monkeys love onsen, and they will drown people who join them in the onsen. So imagine if a wet monkey kind of emerged from the water, it might look almost a little reptiloid. There's even one worse idea, where in ancient Japan there were sometimes babies who were given up and hidden in marshes and riverbeds, and so there is a belief that they became creatures of the river. But today, kappa does more good than harm, and is even seen as lovable by children everywhere as a warning for don't go swimming alone and protect and respect nature. Another really fun yokai is Tsukugo Magami, I can't say it. Too many syllables. This is a newer type of yokai, and it's actually a collection of inanimate objects that gained a spirit. Once an object has been around and treated well for 100 years, it's said to have a spirit embody it. And yes, that means anything. So for those of you who watched her Netflix show, Marie Kondo did say treat your things with respect and even say thank you when you discard them. And it might be because they could turn into a yokai if they're disrespected. So it's part of habitual practices even today in Japan to treat things well. My favorite though is this umbrella figure on the top right. It has grown eyeballs. Often umbrellas are not treated very well. They are left out in bad weather. They bear a lot of the bad storms, or they're discarded outside shops, and they can be blown away pretty easily. That likely inspired a lot of stories on how to take care of your objects, otherwise they'll be pesky and run away from you and resist being used for their daily functions. These figures were used, though, to depict the necessity in creating a no-waste society, and partly why Japan looks so clean in the streets, unless it's a Sunday morning after a Saturday night out. There have been known to be inhabited stirrups from a samurai who mistreated his horse too well. There have been haunted lanterns that burned too long, shoes that were left aside so long that, yes, that spider that lived in it became the shoe. So guess what? These objects, after 100 years, will want payback or revenge for how poorly you treated them. So be kind to your things. Back to women being assaulted. So there are a lot about ghost stories and women, but women can also turn into yokai if you don't treat them right. So this is what happens when a woman is attacked but just won't die. She becomes a yokai where the sheer will to live out of spite of her enemy keeps her alive and almost becomes possessed by a demon. Futakuchi Onna, there on the left, which translates to the woman with two mouths, was attacked by her husband, who didn't want her eating so much because he wanted her to watch her figure. When she refused, he threatened divorce, which was pretty uncommon, so she didn't take the bait. She still disobeyed, asserting that she'd been a good wife and that while she had to do the chores and upkeep with all her duties, she deserved all the food she wanted. So he went at her with a knife and either had terrible aim or could not commit to the decapitation, so he whacked her in the back of the head. To his horror, in the wound grew a new set of jagged teeth and a mouth that also needed to be fed. So she ate double the meals. This story may actually be true, as there are doctor reports of someone in the rural countryside tending to a woman who had a head wound that looked like a mouth as the skin healed and folded over jagged bone fragments of her skull, and it looked red just like a mouth. Rokurokobi is a type of woman who almost loses her head, figuratively speaking. These are women who look ordinary, but at night their necks elongates or creep down the street without leaving their living room. It's believed they committed sins in a past life and now are possessed by an evil spirit that makes them look like a snake. They're said at night to lick handsome men or drink their blood, depending on the reaction they got. But similar to other accounts of women being wronged around the world, my personal suspicion is those women were believed to have long necks because they are perceptive and must listen closely to hear who speaks ill of them in order to get revenge instead of being a scapegoat for men who seek to harm them. That way they are seen as a snake when really they're just looking out for themselves. You may be surprised then, especially the gamers in the audience, to find out that they inspired Pokémon. Mawile and mischievous are both of those, respectively. So next time you catch Pokemon, just think about the women who built those Pokemon along the way throughout history. So now coming more into modern Japan and Emperor Meiji's role in folklore. So Emperor Meiji was the first emperor after the 1860s. If anyone here has been watching Shogun, that is the start of the Shogun era, 250 years before Meiji, when Japan was about to close their borders. Emperor Meiji came about when Japan reopened their borders 250 years later. He's credited as bringing Japan through its largest and most successful growth period in history. It's sometimes called the period of enlightenment or Meiji Restoration, but I consider it neither of those because it implies that there's a lack of knowledge or that there was something that needed fixing, when in reality, Japan was just growing. It's overall then known more accurately as Japan's Industrial Revolution, marked by a keen sense of position it had in the world and desire to be both a contributor in trade and commerce, to strengthen their political system and culture at home, to refine and unify the country, which was previously staunchly operated by the shogun and daimyo separately in different prefectures. He led the country through a balance of both westernization but avoided colonization and exported Japonism, curating a particular image of the country that prevails today. First up, one of the things that he oversaw was the implementation of technology. That includes electricity, telephones, radio, telegraphs, and more, all of it happening in the span of a decade. The country went through basically a shock as they suddenly installed a lot of these poles and wires overnight, which are still a prominent fixation on landscapes and cityscapes today, and changed whole areas overnight. Even famous artists like Hokusai now included them in their portraits that were once very natural and focused on the harmony of urban and natural life, now showed the contrast and reflected the tension in society. People also associated electricity with disease and created a folklore themselves when they could not explain it and how it worked. They feared that when the wires went up, disease would take over their towns. Rumors then were abound, and people rebelled or tore down the wires initially. They weren't wrong to be afraid either, because when the wires went up with the help of Europeans who brought cholera to Japan, they caused pandemics and widespread disaster by disease. Of course, while the wires themselves were not a direct causation, the correlation was enough for many to take it out on the government and protest the changes. It's not so unlike the drama of 5G a few years ago, showing how people may always be suspicious of new technology even if misdirected. Another thing Meiji oversaw was the introduction of chocolate. The Dutch were the first to bring over the chocolate in the 1870s, and for a couple of years there was interest before suspicion over ingredients in foreign food erupted as people associated chocolate with sickness. There were rumors then that coagulated cow blood was the attribution to the color of chocolate because they had only ever seen milk as white. So the confectionery had a brief downfall in Japan. Ironically though, and through the power of marketing, with a prompt from the government to focus on nationalization of nutrition, condensed milk did become a food for those in the army or those who were sick. The marketing around chocolate evolved to something that was more accepted once the science explained milk products, yogurts, and the rumors vanished overnight. It was also probably too delicious to be considered evil. So ghost trains, phantom trains, and maiden hair, what do those possibly have in common? Phantom trains were also a phenomenon in the Meiji era because train conductors were told to drive their trains for long hours, 12, 14 hours, and similar to today's society with semi-truck drivers who drive for long hours into the night in rural areas, they'll start to see shapes. And the greatest fear of a conductor was being on a track, a single track with another train coming at him. So that would be the apparition that he believed he would see, would be these phantom trains that would come at him. Now there was also a belief then, because they tried to explain that steam fueled a lot of these trains. People did not like the smoke, people did not like the smell. And what happens when there's metal that oxidizes with water? It kind of smells irony, which smells like blood. So Maidens feared that they would be snatched up and kidnapped and given to the emperor to run the trains on their blood. So women, like here pictured on the right, even though she was unmarried, she wore her hair up like a married woman so she would not be kidnapped by the trains. Now, a lot of these rumors and what could have been folklore spread through the news. These stories were actually reprinted in early newspapers, showing that regional leaders didn't know yet how to best utilize the sharing of media. Newspapers were new during the Meiji era. And instead of fanning the flames, or instead of, I guess they did the opposite, they did fan the flames instead of disputing and sharing the science. So they employed the ever-popular art styles of ukiyo-e and folklore, using a Western medium to tell these stories, but similar in a way that Japanese were accustomed to. However, as the rumors spiraled, Meiji and others worked to reform journalism and make them more official communications to talk about science, technology, and current affairs so that everyone would accept and grow with the nation. And these two can be accredited for a lot of the curation of Japan's image and folklore today. A lot of these stories reflect how Westernization was perceived by Japanese. There was a lot of tension and a lot of rejection at first until national unity came into play. Although the presence of yokai receded, a new fear and enemy was emerging in stories and threatened the peace among civilians. Fearing isolation, again due to being lost in translation, Meiji employed historians and folklorists, experts in culture and literature, to help unify the nation through knowledge. Meiji also wanted to share the best stories from Japan with the world. But with 8 million different stories, how do you pick which stories to tell? These two men, pictured here, helped even oversee some of the country's first libraries, which now became places for record keeping, taking away the necessity of family trees and stories previously recorded and archived by temples and shrines, and government papers and books on science and technology moved to public spaces and away from the wealthy, so that all could learn and enjoy. Prominent literature was translated and reprinted, and only selected Japanese stories were put on shelves. So what then happened to folklore? Japonism is a global interest in Japan that took the world by storm. When Japan participated in the 1868 World Fair in Paris and subsequently the 1876 World Fair in Philadelphia, its popularity and curiosity skyrocketed. There had been a lot of allure around Japan because for 250 years it had been an isolated country shrouded in mystery. During the Civil War, Matthew Perry, a U.S. commander, was ordered to set sail and reopen Japan to give the U.S. a win. He did. He had 3 letters with him, all written in English, Chinese, and French. None of them were in Japanese. But through the power of understanding kanji, he was able to get his message across, and he showed them a lot of guns. Japonism inspired a wave then of art, literature, and dress. Van Gogh, Monet, Degas, and Stevens were famous artists who all incorporated Japan into their own creations. The wealthy imported Japanese glass and pottery and furniture. Meiji was behind a lot of what was chosen to be shared, having eliminated the samurai and all foes in the country, and was ready to show a softer side of Japan and illuminate their relationship with nature especially. They downplayed their beliefs in religious symbolism and played up folk tales and heroes, and even mastered the technology used to create European dishware and furniture to better appeal to Western tastes. And here's how they picked some of that folklore to tell about. Popularly, Japan is known for its adoration of cats. Cats are seen as mysterious creatures who hold magical powers, and who can blame them for believing so? Have you ever seen a cat stare at a blank wall and suddenly spin out of nowhere or hiss at nothing? Older generations believed that cats were somewhat of a gateway being between real and spiritual world, because that was the only explanation they could think of, and that they hold some god powers, not a lot. Maneki-neko, for example, is a shape-shifting cat that can play music. Cats that are gathering are known to be plotting something or summoning demons. And then, of course, there are some helpful cats. For example, one stormy night in the outskirts of Tokyo, there was a peddler who got lost in the storm, and when he came upon a gate that was cracked open, he saw a cat at the gate beckoning him forward. He sought shelter and believed the cat saved his life. While plausible, To me, it's highly unlikely that the cat was beckoning him and probably just cleaning his paw. But he mistook it for a beckoning sign. And when he told his story, there was a woman in Tokyo, a merchant, who could not stop dreaming about the waving cat. So she created it into pottery, leading it to a widespread visual of Japan that became a global sensation. In ancient Japan and Japanese culture, the cherry blossom also needed a little bit of rehabilitation. The trees represented rebirth, particularly among warriors, to represent their delicate side. They often were planted on top of samurai graves, hoping they would be reborn into the tree and continue blooming and living year after year. Sometimes the planting went wrong and the trees split, spilling the ghosts out or inhabiting the wrong spirits and spreading evil. However, early diplomats and visitors to Japan were enamored by the blossoms, and the Japanese decided that would be a great friendship gift, but didn't want other nations to think they were receiving ghosts or spirits. So the symbolism changed from those embodying warriors to more on a metaphor for life and how fleeting and beautiful it is, and a reminder for how fragile it can be. And each spring, we here in DC enjoy the Japanese gifted blossoms. Now also, they weren't just concerned about what stories to export, but what to import into Japan. They had centuries of news and history to catch up on after 250 years of isolation, and they needed to make it appealing and exciting to Japanese readers who've been reading about yokai and oni all their lives. So therefore, it was recommended to translate historical stories from around the world into something more appealing. I will interrupt to ask the audience if anyone recognizes which historical figure this is. And I did swap the image in Bursit to make it harder to read. I'll give you a tiny hint. We are in the city of Washington, D.C. That is George Washington, who is battling the evil Europeans to liberate this country. Here he is again. I would read that textbook. Today, though, some of the stories, no matter how outlandish, have persisted into our imagination today. When you next travel to Japan or watch a movie, anime, or read manga, you may even see origins rooted right in the language leaping off the page. Let's see what other things that you can spot all around you when you visit Japan. Temples often have guardians. Sometimes, yes, it's Oni, the big scary guys, and sometimes it's Kitsune, here holding a key to the other world. Or it's lions on the right-hand side. I cut off the picture of the other one, but one has its mouth open, the other one has a mouth closed. It's from ancient, like Sanskrit, showing how intertwined Shintoism and Buddhism can be. The torii gates, also pictured, will also be places to pass under to ward off negativity. Zen gardens are places of spirituality and harmony. They weren't just for wealthy, but meant for everyone to bask in and enjoy. They're also places to keep gods and kami safe, including spirits that inhabit nature. Now, the reason Zen gardens often have zigzag pathways is because they believe demons walk in straight lines, so they can't follow you through the garden. And then, as you might remember in some Studio Ghibli movies, Kodama represented of the nature spirits. There are still rituals today, too, in which people use to protect themselves against yokai and spirits. You'll find a lot of these all throughout. In fact, people take omamori, on the left, home with them, often as souvenirs from Japanese temples. Now, you are supposed to burn it after 1 year, so if you keep them too long, it might turn into a yokai. And then also, morigyo is protective salt that you'll see sometimes placed outside shop doors even today. And you'll still see beloved yokai, even though there are not many news stories of yokai anymore. The yokai of yesterday are still prominent fixtures, especially in temples and museums all around Japan, showing deep appreciation for these historical beings that have long inspired stories of good versus evil, protection and good luck, and how we treat the world around us and our neighbors. The spirits are also revered. Though science now has been able to explain a lot of phenomena in nature, and history has been rewritten to tell the truth of some horrible or good events, there is still a deep respect and tradition for the yokai and kami. Every summer, for example, you'll see a lot of celebrations around ancestors, spirits, and folklore. There's even parades of demons in which people will dress up as their favorite yokai and walk through the streets. They're still heralded today because while Emperor Meiji ushered in an incredible posture of science and technology for professionals to develop the nation and curate an outward image of Japan for the world, it left folklore in flux and nowhere official to go. But as it turns out, they didn't need to put it anywhere. It left it entirely for the people to pass on the stories for generation after generation, to teach the lessons and carry on the past and evolve them for cultures today. Now we have holidays, we still have superstitions and silly rituals, sometimes, and beliefs that still guide and teach us and delight others because, as it turns out, folklore is all around us. So, thank you so much.
Okay, can I have one more warm round of applause for our wonderful speakers? So I know I said something about a moderated discussion, but I want to make sure, because I've actually had the chance to talk to Natalie before we've had this wonderful lecture, and so I kind of already got to talk to her and ask her all the questions that I wanted to ask. So how about we just go to the question and answer session? So does anyone here have any questions for our speaker? And also just a reminder, this is the book she wrote. I don't know if it was mentioned. It was going to be brought up in the discussion. So if you have read it, I do highly recommend it. It is a fun. It's a good summer read if you need some chills to cool off. Any questions? We have one back here.
Hi, that was fabulous. Everyone in this room is going to tell me what the word is because I can't remember, but the term for cute things.
Kawaii? Yeah.
Is there anything historical or is there any value to cuteness? Or
How many hours you got? That was actually part of the modernization of a lot of Japanese folklore as well. That is part of a movement after World War II when a lot of stories were adapted for a global stage. It's a very fascinating topic. There is a utility for it, but there's not a lot of historical aspects to it. It is a modern invention.
Thank you very much. You showed us a couple of the characters from Pokemon. I was kind of curious, are all of them kind of associated to some type of tale because they're kind of strange each in their own way?
They are all strange. There are ties to a lot of them, even Blaziken. There's a story of a fire chicken a long time ago. I think it was choking on charcoal and it breathed fire for a second before dying. However, the most famous one, Pikachu, is a little bit more ambiguous because there are gods of thunder, but it doesn't look like Pikachu. So there are some that take a lot of liberties. And then people always laugh about the Pokemon, the keychain, which is just a clump of keys. But as you saw, inanimate objects can be embodied by a spirit after 100 years. So they do all have some kind of tenuous connection. There are, yeah. There was a lot of gender fluidity in ancient Japan, actually. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Is there a hard line between like Shinto spirits and kami and yokai? Is there a significant difference?
Most of them will come from Shintoism. Buddhism is a lot more spiritual and inward, and Shintoism will have more of the outward spirits and creatures.
You included some fantastic images of lions and tigers and lion-like beasts. Do you have a sense of when do those first enter Japanese culture? I assume they would be imported for shock value.
So yes, so they got a lot of the lion imagery from Buddhism, which, yes, that was thousands of years old. And it's very debated about whether or not Japanese ever saw lions until more recently. There are possibly some stories of some creatures being sent on boats to be part of a traveling show of some kind, maybe 300 years ago. So there is a small chance they saw a lion, or some people of nobility did, but a lot of it was just images derived from Buddhism from mainland Asia. So I started writing the book in 2010 in college when I was studying the Meiji era through film. And the stories that inspired the folklore fascinated me, especially during the Meiji era of transformation. So in 2010, I started writing the book. A professor told me I was going about it the wrong way, so of course I gave up on it for a decade. But between that time, I lived in Japan for 6 years, and that entire time I was listening to stories and experiencing so much of the culture, learning a lot more of the language, reading a lot more. And so in 2020, when I had a lot more time on my hands, I decided I'm still remembering this story. So I went back and I kind of did a big info dump of everything I had learned in the last 10 years about Japan, and I needed to write it all down somewhere in some form. And I did take a couple years more to write it, and I interviewed a lot of historians and experts. My favorite interview was with an astrologist who works with geisha to do fortune telling. So it was a very intense couple-year period during the writing process, but it's been a decade plus of research through experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And I'm an independent documentary director, and I try to film a documentary about Chinese dialects. So during my process, I find that due to modernization and several other reasons, the traditional culture in China just gradually fade away. So I want to ask, would you like to explain more how to be modern and at the same time preserve the Japanese culture? Thank you.
That's a really big question. There is a lot of preservation of the stories. A lot of it is told through families, and that's always a big challenge. But a lot of it also has come from other nations too. So there's a lot of interesting history and culture between all these countries and relationships. The toughest thing the toughest thing is preservation, because there are so many different accounts, but the best way we can preserve it is keep talking about it and keep writing about it, even if it will evolve to suit cultures of today. It becomes very cute. Yeah, especially if it becomes cute.
Thank you very much. That was a fabulous talk. I'm just curious, what archives or collections did you engage with, and how did that spark your creativity in terms of the book that you were writing?
I actually went back first to a professor who I'd had at the University of Oregon. He's at UCLA now, and he directed me to a lot of original sources. I reached out, I cold emailed some professors at Boston University who specialize in the Meiji-Era and folklore. They directed me to other sources. Museums, I became very cozy with Smithsonian museums, and then also the Boston Art Museum too. When I reached out to everyone who I could possibly think of who had a relationship or knowledge of folklore and the Meiji era, because I believe when you research and tell a story, you can't just get one side of it. You need all the sides you can possibly find, and that's really hard in history because it's often told by one voice, but thankfully there were a lot of sources I could pull from in Japanese folklore and history.
Thank you. You mentioned the figure of 8 million yokai. Do you know, where did that number come from? Was there an effort to kind of collect their stories?
It's an estimation. It's an estimation, and it's partly because of all of the record keeping that temples and shrines have. Japan has been keeping records for thousands of years, and they're still preserved pretty well today. So there's a huge archive system, and it's kind of become an estimation. Now, there aren't 8 million stories, there are 8 million names of yokai. So sometimes you'll just see a name once, and no one has any idea the context for it. Or one of my favorites is there was a board game 200 years ago, and it kind of got destroyed because it's a 200-year-old board game, but people saw pictures of different yokai that are still preserved today that don't really have names, but they're like, well, I guess this is another one. So it's mostly through the records of temples, shrines for thousands of years, though, that account for them.
You might have mentioned this, so sorry if I missed it, but was there any protection protocol, like against the more devil-adjacent yokai?
So nothing like exorcisms, if you're asking that. There are just very simple, basic protections that people embody. Like it's usually carrying a charm that's blessed by a priest, or putting salt around your door, which salt is something that culturally around the world is seen as a cleanser. So that's also what's fascinating, is that a lot of these practices are related to others. So it does kind of call into question how much are these stories are exchanged globally, and where do some of these ideas come from, or did people have all these ideas separately? So what is it? But yeah, those are the two most simple ones.
Hey, mine's kind of a two-part question. One, what resources would you recommend, we could use to get started if we want to learn more about this topic? And two, I want to know what your opinion was on Lafcadio Hearn.
On what?
Lafcadio Hearn, if you're familiar with his work. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, where would you recommend, if someone wants to learn more, what resources, books to get started?
I think our friends here at the Library of Congress are a great place to start. And honestly, I resort to Wikipedia a lot, because Wikipedia has a ton of citations, and those will show you original sources. From there, I recommend also, if you can, find books, depending on your level of Japanese, find Japanese literature that's been translated into English, and that's where you can learn a lot of folklore and how it exists and comes up today in literature.
Hi. I have not read your book, but I will. But I would love to hear more about how Japanese folklore and everything you talked about today inspired it, for those of us who haven't read it or haven't heard of it before.
Yeah, so as the cover implies, there is a presence of the phantom trains that I talked about briefly during the Meiji era. So that's somewhat of a mild spoiler. The cover just spoils it, I guess. But so I was fascinated in this idea of Japan's transformation during the Meiji era, and how it was almost night and day. They went from a culture that was so rooted in these generational traditions to suddenly in 10 years they were talking on the phone and had trains. And what does that do to a population? How do you even comprehend the changes that are happening? And we have a lot of changes happening now, so I feel like there was maybe some similarity in just feeling inundated by so many changes, so much news every day. And I wanted to see, well, what would the life of a young woman be like back then, especially as her rights, her nobility, her status all changed. The traditions she once practiced were now gone, and how she was still seeing yokai and folklore everywhere, even though the stories were being wiped away. So it's an exploration of culture and how it can change during a transformative period with new technology.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions.
I know you said your specialty was Meiji-Era, but with the transition and time and effects, whatever, the next one after that would probably be World War II, right? So how did that affect folklore? Up, down, that kind of thing?
So Meiji unified the country and created a lot of curated ideas of a nation that was all together under this umbrella of nationalism. And it had a lot of stories that were just sort of set. And during World War II, a lot of it did come out as they were more about showing foreign entities were not always maybe to be trusted. So the imagery of the tiger and the snakes reappeared. But it's not really so much my area of expertise, but it did somewhat go into a stalled period because of the way he had set up the nation. Everyone was ready to be fully involved and fighting in the war. everyone was in a way enlisted, even if they weren't directly on the battlefield. So it was very much like unified, like we have to do this kind of thing all together. But folklore then took a back seat. There was not much entertainment. It was a very different era of Japan.
Okay, well, I think that's. Oh, we got one more.
It may be somewhat useful. You mentioned the concept of demons among the Japanese, which sounds strange to us, but putting it outside of current revelation, Socrates had that concept. What he called demons but weren't necessarily malevolent. There's spirits that got involved with humans.
Yeah, that's true. That's true too.
Sorry, I stepped over. Well, thank you all for attending tonight's talk, Unmasking Japanese Folklore, with author Natalie Jacobsen. So this evening, just I guess a few announcements before you leave. Well, we invite you to stick around, chat, and enjoy our Edo Miniatures pop-up exhibition. It has been extended and it will close next Thursday, so one more week. And it'll be the same day as our August film screening, A Samurai in Time. I think I have the wrong title here. It is sold out, but every once in a while tickets do free up when people cancel last minute. So there is also a booth by the Library of Congress that is out in the front. You might have seen it as you walked in. It's featuring reproductions and prints of yokai folklore and Meiji technology. If you haven't already, please check it out. And the two lovely Library of Congress librarians, Japanese specialists, they will be sticking around to answer any questions that you may have. And then, as the title of the event suggests, there is a sake tasting booth. So as you mingle, talk, enjoy the various artifacts, please enjoy some sake. Finally, if you enjoy this event, a survey will be sent out later this evening, and paper surveys are in the gallery. When or if you have a moment, please complete the survey. It helps ensure that we're able to bring more events like this to you. Thank you once again for attending this event, and we hope you have a wonderful evening. People might crowd you to talk about but at the same time, we can also just bring you out. This is Ariga.
Hi, how are you? Okay.
But also, if you want to escape into the
try and lead them away.
Yeah, that works too. I think actually, can you Sure. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Oh no, it is okay.
Do you want me to put this in the? I'll take it into the office.
Please. Thank you. I
Of
appreciate
course.
it.
No, thank you.
Okay.
I'll come down. Hello. We found a glasses case. Has anyone dropped a glasses case? Thank you. They're being lifted up right here. It's black. It had some words written on it. Maybe not. Dudes? That's glasses case? Maybe not. There are sunglasses in there. If anyone has lost their sunglasses, please come let me know.